The second I walked through those carved wooden doors, I felt it in my bones. This was either going to be the most brilliant move of my life or the most catastrophic mistake I'd ever make. Diana Hartwell's face contorted into something halfway between a smile and a sneer, like she just tasted spoiled milk, but was trying to maintain her composure for the cameras that weren't even there. Her eyes swept over me from head to toe, taking in my simple gray dress, my comfortable ballet flats, my plain silver hoops from the department store. I could practically see the calculator running behind her eyes, adding up my worth and arriving at a big fat zero. She leaned toward her daughter, my girlfriend Sophia, and whispered something she clearly thought I couldn't catch, but I heard every single syllable. She said I looked like the maid who'd gotten confused and used the front entrance instead of the service door. That's when I knew this lunch was going to be absolutely fascinating. My name is Maya Chen. I'm 29 years old, and I need to tell you something. For the past 16 months, I've been keeping a massive secret from the woman I was planning to propose to. Not a small secret, like finishing the leftover cake and blaming it on my roommate. Not a medium secret, like still having my childhood blanket tucked under my bed. No, my secret was that I earn $42,000 every month. Before taxes, the number is even more ridiculous. After taxes, it's still the kind of figure that makes financial advisors pause and ask if I've made a typo. I'm the lead data scientist at one of the biggest pharmaceutical research companies in the Northeast. I've been programming algorithms since I was 14, launched my first medical prediction software at 23, and have been rising through the ranks ever since. I hold 4 patents on predictive health technology. I've been keynote speaker at global conferences. I have equity shares that would make your head spin. And Sophia thought I was a lab technician who barely scraped by each month. I never technically lied to her. When we met at a book reading 17 months ago, she asked what I did for work, and I told her I worked in medical research. She nodded like she got it, then asked if I mainly handled specimen samples and equipment maintenance. I smiled and said something vague about contributing to the research process. She connected the dots herself, and I simply never corrected the picture she'd painted. Why would I do something like this? Why would I let the woman I was falling for, the woman I was planning my future with, believe I was struggling to pay rent, when I could have bought her entire apartment building without blinking? Because I learned something crucial a long time ago from the most important person in my entire world. My aunt raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 9. She lived in a simple townhouse in a working-class neighborhood, drove a 15-year-old sedan, shopped at discount grocery stores, and never wore anything that screamed money. She taught me to make meals from scratch, to find joy in everyday moments, to never measure my value by the numbers in my investment portfolio. What I didn't discover until she passed away when I was 25 was that my aunt was worth over $8 million. She had built a revolutionary medical supply distribution network in her 20s, invested brilliantly, and deliberately chose to live without flash because she believed integrity mattered more than image. She left me her entire fortune, along with a handwritten note that I still keep in my bedroom drawer. In that note, she wrote something that has guided every major decision I've made since. She said that someone's authentic nature only reveals itself when they believe nobody significant is paying attention, when they think you have nothing valuable to contribute, when they assume you're not worth their respect. That's when their real character comes through crystal clear. So when Sophia invited me to lunch at her family's country house, when she hinted that this might be when things became official, when she mentioned that her mother had very specific expectations about who was good enough for her daughter, I made a calculated decision. I would give the Hartwell family the exact test my aunt had designed. I would show up as the simple, unassuming person they were expecting. I would wear humble clothes and drive my aging car and talk modestly about my circumstances. And I would observe. I would watch how they treated someone they assumed was insignificant, someone they assumed was beneath their social standing, someone they assumed brought nothing valuable to the table. Before you judge my choices, before you think I was being dishonest or manipulative, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what your partner's family truly thinks of you when you're not in the room? Have you ever felt that uncomfortable suspicion that the warmth is manufactured and the kindness is conditional? Have you ever desperately wanted to know the unfiltered truth, even if that truth might shatter your heart? I wanted to know. I needed to know, because I wasn't just thinking about dating Sophia. I was thinking about building a life with her. And families, as my aunt also taught me, they're not temporary. They're woven into every holiday, every milestone, every important moment. They're forever. Now listen, before we continue, I want to say something from my heart. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community, so we can bring more truthful stories for you. It truly means everything to me. All right, let's get back to what happened next. The Hartwell estate was exactly the display of excess I had anticipated, and somehow still managed to catch me off guard with its sheer audacity. The entrance driveway stretched longer than entire blocks in my neighborhood. The gates were wrought iron, decorated with brass details, because apparently plain iron wasn't ostentatious enough. The gardens were maintained with the kind of obsessive precision that suggested someone measured every hedge with architectural tools. As I pulled my 14-year-old Honda Civic up that immaculate driveway, I caught my reflection in the side mirror. Minimal makeup, hair in a simple braid, my aunt's small pearl studs in my ears, the only jewelry I'd chosen to wear. I looked exactly like someone who didn't fit into this world, exactly perfect for what I needed to accomplish. Sophia met me at the entrance with a kiss that felt oddly staged, like she was performing for invisible spectators. Her eyes flickered over my outfit, my shoes, my bare wrists, and I caught something in her expression I'd never noticed before. Shame. She was ashamed of how I looked. I made a mental note of that reaction for later analysis. Inside, the house was a shrine to new wealth, desperately cosplaying as established lineage. Massive chandeliers dominated every ceiling. Artwork in ornate frames covered the walls, though I recognized them as high-quality reproductions, not authentic pieces. The furniture was clearly expensive, but looked rigid and unwelcoming, selected for status rather than comfort. And there, positioned in the entrance hall like a monarch surveying her territory, stood Diana Hartwell. She appeared to be in her late 50s, with the kind of face that had clearly benefited from exceptional cosmetic work. Her platinum hair was styled in a rigid helmet that probably required commercial-grade products to maintain. Her outfit was designer label, her jewelry was genuine, and her smile was completely, utterly artificial. She extended her hand to me like she was bestowing a royal favor. I shook it and felt the weakness in her grip, the dismissal, the absolute absence of genuine warmth. Then she made that comment to Sophia, the one comparing me to confused household staff, and I smiled sweetly and pretended I hadn't heard a word. The afternoon was about to become incredibly revealing. If I'd known everything I was walking into that day, I might have worn emotional armor instead of a gray dress. But then again, I've always believed the strongest protection is thorough preparation, and I had done extensive research. The Hartwell family controlled a network of luxury home goods boutiques across 5 states, not the trendy designer shops you see in fashion magazines, but upscale furnishing stores that cater to wealthy families redecorating their mansions. Sophia's mother, Diana, had married into the family at 24 and had immediately dedicated herself to social climbing with the focus of someone who knew exactly what prizes she wanted to collect. They had 2 daughters. Sophia, my girlfriend, was 31 and worked as a marketing consultant for a firm that had no connection to the family business. This was apparently a source of ongoing tension with Diana, who had expected her daughter to eventually take over the boutique empire. Then there was Margot, the younger sister, who was 27 and treated the family wealth like her personal, unlimited credit card. I had gathered all this through public records, social media deep dives, and strategic internet searches. I had studied photos of elaborate parties, high society fundraisers, and charity auctions. I had read articles about Diana's philanthropic activities, though closer examination revealed most of her donations came with substantial tax advantages and guaranteed publicity. None of that research had prepared me for experiencing Margot in person. She arrived 30 minutes late, which I would later understand was her signature power move. making a dramatic entrance mattered more to her than respecting anyone else's schedule. She swept into the sitting room wearing an outfit that cost more than most people's car payments, with gemstones hanging from her ears and throat like she'd been caught in a jewelry store explosion. Her greeting to me consisted of a single word delivered with all the warmth of a frozen fish stick. Hey. Not hey, nice to meet you. Not hey, Sophia's told me about you. Just hey. With a slight nose wrinkle that suggested she detected an unpleasant odor. I smiled and said hey back. She immediately turned to her mother and launched into a conversation that deliberately excluded me, discussing some gala event and whether the event planner should be replaced after last month's supposed disaster. I stood there, clutching the glass of water I'd been offered, feeling about as welcome as a vegetarian at a barbecue competition. Sophia hovered nearby, looking distinctly uncomfortable, but not saying anything to change the dynamic. That was the second observation I filed away for later consideration. Diana's husband, Robert Hartwell, was an entirely different personality. He was a broad-shouldered man who had probably been athletic decades ago, but had since surrendered to the comforts of wealth. He shook my hand with a grip clearly meant to impress, but that just felt weary. His eyes were calculating, though, and I noticed him studying me with something that resembled curiosity. There was one additional guest at this lunch, someone whose presence I hadn't anticipated. An older gentleman named Thomas Wellington, who was introduced as a longtime family friend and business partner. He was in his early 70s, with silver-gray hair and observant eyes that seemed to catalog everything. When he shook my hand, his gaze stayed on my face with a flash of recognition that puzzled me. Did we know each other? Had our paths crossed somewhere before? I couldn't place him, and he didn't mention anything, but throughout the afternoon I kept catching him watching me with that same thoughtful expression. Diana directed us into the dining room, which was decorated like someone had been handed unlimited funds and zero sense of restraint. The table was long enough to seat a diplomatic delegation. The chairs were upholstered in what appeared to be authentic silk, and the place settings included more utensils than I'd ever seen outside of a culinary school. I counted them. 7 different utensils at each setting, 7 for a single lunch. I've seen medical procedures performed with less equipment. Diana noticed me examining the silverware and produced that frozen smile of hers. She said with dripping false sympathy that she supposed I wasn't familiar with formal dining etiquette. I responded that my aunt always taught me it's not the silverware that defines a meal, but the people you share it with. Diana's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Margot made a small snorting sound into her water glass. And lunch began. The first course was some kind of chilled soup I couldn't identify, but that probably cost more per serving than my weekly coffee budget. Diana used this opportunity to begin what I would later characterize as the systematic interrogation. She asked where I had grown up. I said a small coastal town in Maine, which was accurate. She asked about my background. I said my aunt had raised me, also accurate. She asked what had happened to my parents. I said they died in an accident when I was a child. Diana made a sound that was theoretically sympathetic, but came out sounding like a clogged pipe clearing. She said how challenging that must have been, growing up without proper parental guidance. I said my aunt provided every bit of guidance I ever needed. Margot leaned forward, her gemstones catching the light from the chandelier above. She asked what my aunt had done professionally. I said she had been in the medical supply business. Margot's eyebrows lifted slightly. She asked what kind of medical supply business. I said distribution and logistics. The actual truth, naturally, was that my aunt had built an innovative company that revolutionized medical supply chain management and eventually sold it for millions. But that wasn't the kind of truth that would serve my purpose today. Diana moved to her next topic of investigation. She asked about my current employment. I said I worked in pharmaceutical research. She asked if I was a lab assistant. I said I was more in a support capacity for the research teams. Diana nodded, with an expression of confirmation, as if this validated everything she had already decided about me. She said how nice that every research team needed support personnel. Sophia shifted uncomfortably in her chair but remained silent, and that's when Margot decided to introduce the subject of Vanessa. Vanessa. The name dropped into the conversation like a stone into calm water, creating ripples that spread across the entire table. Margot said the name so casually, like she was commenting on the weather or the quality of the soup. She said she'd bumped into Vanessa the previous week, that she looked fantastic, that her family's company was flourishing. I watched Sophia's face carefully. Something flickered there, quickly suppressed. Anxiety? Guilt? It vanished before I could properly identify it. Diana seized the thread with the enthusiasm of someone who had been anticipating this exact moment. She said Vanessa had always been such a wonderful person, so accomplished, so naturally suited to their family's lifestyle. She had dated Sophia for 4 years. Did I know that? I said I didn't. Diana smiled with satisfaction. She said it was such a disappointment when they had separated. Everyone had assumed they would eventually marry. Vanessa's family owned a luxury furniture import business that would have been an ideal match for the Hartwell boutiques. Vanessa had been the correct choice. I was not. I glanced around the dining room and noticed for the first time a collection of framed photographs on the credenza behind me. I turned slightly in my seat and saw a curated display of family memories, holidays, celebrations, milestone moments. And in at least 5 of those photographs, a striking auburn-haired woman stood beside Sophia, their arms linked, her smile radiant. Vanessa. Diana tracked my gaze and said nothing, but her satisfaction was practically tangible in the air. Margot twisted the knife with obvious pleasure. She said Vanessa was still unattached, actually, such a mystery that nobody had claimed her yet, almost as if she was holding out for something or perhaps someone specific. I turned back to face the table and smiled calmly. I said she sounded like an exceptional person. This response clearly wasn't what Margot had anticipated. She blinked, momentarily thrown off her script. She agreed that yes, Vanessa was exceptional. And then with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer, she added that she hoped I wouldn't feel too overwhelmed in their social circle, given my more humble origins. I asked what exactly she meant by humble. Diana's smile developed an edge. She said she understood that not everyone was born with certain privileges, that some people had to work regular jobs and live regular lives, that there was absolutely no shame in being ordinary. Ordinary. She had actually called me ordinary. I felt something crystallize inside me. But I kept my expression perfectly neutral and pleasant. I had come here today to discover the truth about these people, and the truth was revealing itself with absolute clarity. Sophia finally spoke up. She said her mother didn't intend anything negative by that comment, that she was simply being protective of her. Diana patted her daughter's hand and said of course she was protective. A mother always wants the absolute best for her child. The unspoken conclusion hung in the space between us, like smoke. And you are clearly not the best. Robert cleared his throat and attempted to redirect the conversation. He asked about my interests, whether I had any hobbies outside of work. I said I enjoyed reading, hiking, preparing simple home-cooked meals. Nothing extravagant. Margot laughed and said that was absolutely adorable, like a child listing their favorite activities at summer camp. Thomas, the family friend, spoke for the first time since we'd been seated. He said he thought there was genuine value in simple pleasures, that his own mother had lived a modest lifestyle and been one of the most content people he'd ever encountered. Diana shot him a look that could have curdled dairy products. Thomas ignored her completely and continued observing me with that same searching, puzzled expression. He asked what my aunt's full name had been. Thomas's eyebrows rose noticeably, but he didn't elaborate, just nodded thoughtfully and returned his attention to his soup bowl. The remainder of lunch proceeded in essentially the same pattern. Diana and Margot alternated asking questions specifically designed to remind me of my supposed place in their hierarchy, which in their minds was somewhere far below their social standing. Sophia made occasional weak attempts to redirect or defend me, but her efforts lacked conviction. Robert remained mostly quiet, observing the proceedings with the resigned exhaustion of someone who had learned years ago that challenging his wife's behavior was futile. And throughout everything, Thomas continued watching me with that intent, curious expression. By the time the dessert course arrived, I had absorbed everything I needed to understand about the Hartwell family. They were elitists of the most predictable variety, the kind who calculated human values strictly in terms of wealth and social connections. They viewed me as an impediment to be removed, a complication to be resolved, an error in judgment Sophia had made that required correction. But I had also discovered something else, something more personally painful that I hadn't fully expected. Sophia was not the person I had believed her to be. The Sophia I had fallen in love with had been compassionate and engaged and genuinely interested in me as a complete human being. But this Sophia, the one who sat at her mother's table and allowed her family to systematically tear me down without mounting any real defense, was someone fundamentally different, someone weaker, someone who valued her family's approval more than protecting the person she claimed to love. I found myself wondering which version was the authentic Sophia. I was about to discover the answer. After dessert, Diana announced we would have coffee in the garden room. The men drifted toward the windows to discuss business matters, while Margot excused herself to take an urgent phone call. Diana said she needed to speak with the household staff about something and would rejoin us momentarily. This left me alone with my thoughts, and a valuable opportunity. I excused myself to find the restroom. Sophia directed me toward the back of the house, down a long corridor lined with more pretentious artwork. I walked deliberately slowly, absorbing the details. The house was impressive from a purely financial perspective, but it felt sterile, empty, like a museum display that nobody actually inhabited. The restroom was simple to locate, but locating it wasn't my actual objective. What I was really searching for was information, context, some insight that would help me fully process everything that was happening. I found something significantly more valuable than that. As I walked past a partially closed door, I heard voices, Diana's voice, and Margot's. I stopped walking. Every instinct urged me to keep moving, to respect their privacy, to not eavesdrop like some character in a melodramatic television show. But something in Diana's tone made me pause, something sharp and urgent. I moved closer to the door, staying carefully in the shadowed part of the corridor. Diana was saying they needed to handle this situation immediately, that Sophia couldn't be permitted to make this catastrophic mistake. Margot agreed enthusiastically. She said she couldn't believe Sophia had actually brought this woman to their home, that she had assumed this was just a temporary phase, like Sophia's brief pottery obsession from 2 years ago. Diana said this was far more serious than a hobby. This woman could destroy everything they had been planning. I felt my pulse quicken. They were discussing me. Obviously they were discussing me. But what came next was what genuinely made my blood turn cold. Margot said the timing couldn't possibly be worse. She said they desperately needed the merger with the Castellano family to proceed successfully. And Sophia needed to be with Vanessa for that arrangement to work. Castellano. That was Vanessa's family name, the luxury furniture importers. Diana agreed emphatically. She said the boutiques were experiencing serious financial difficulties, that they absolutely required the Castellano partnership to survive the upcoming fiscal year. I felt the ground shift beneath me. The Hartwell boutiques were in financial crisis. I had suspected something from fragments in my research, but this confirmation was staggering. Margot continued speaking. She said Sophia was supposed to maintain Vanessa's romantic interest while they finalized the business details. That was the established plan. Vanessa's family would invest substantial capital in the boutiques, and in exchange, they would gain access to the Hartwell distribution channels. Diana said Sophia had assured her she was keeping her options available with Vanessa. Options available, while she was planning a future with me. I leaned against the corridor wall, my mind processing rapidly. This wasn't simple family snobbery. This wasn't just relatives who disapproved of their daughter's relationship choice. This was calculated, strategic, manipulative. Sophia wasn't merely a weak person who couldn't stand up to her domineering mother. Sophia was actively deceiving me. But why? What purpose did I serve if Vanessa was always the intended outcome? Margot answered my unspoken question perfectly. She said Sophia was such an idiot. She actually seemed to have genuine feelings for this nobody, this lab technician. She was supposed to use her as a temporary placeholder until the arrangement with Vanessa was properly secured, but she was developing real attachment. A placeholder. That's what I represented to them. A placeholder. A distraction. Someone to keep Sophia occupied while the family orchestrated their business transactions. Diana said they would manage it appropriately. She said they would proceed with the engagement announcement today, get Sophia publicly committed to this woman, and then engineer a way to terminate the relationship before any actual wedding occurred. Once they had Vanessa secured in the business deal, they would manufacture some terrible revelation about me that would justify ending the engagement. Margot asked, what kind of terrible revelation? Diana said they would invent something if necessary. I stood in that corridor, completely frozen, listening to two women plot the systematic destruction of my relationship, like they were planning a weekend shopping trip. And then Margot said something that made the entire situation even more infuriating. She said at least this woman was too unsophisticated to suspect anything, that Sophia had chosen well in that respect. She was naive, trusting, probably just grateful that someone like Sophia had shown her romantic interest at all. I stepped quietly back from the door, moving silently down the corridor. My hands were trembling, but not from hurt or devastation, from pure crystallized anger. They thought I was unsophisticated. They thought I was naive. They thought I was so desperate for love and validation that I would accept whatever scraps of affection they threw in my direction. They had absolutely no comprehension of who they were actually dealing with. I found the restroom, splashed cold water on my face, and studied myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was not broken or defeated. She was strategizing. I had come here today to test Sophia's family, and they had failed that test so spectacularly it was almost impressive. But the test had exposed something I genuinely hadn't anticipated. Sophia herself was fundamentally part of the problem. She wasn't simply caught between me and her family's expectations. She was actively participating in the deception. The question now was what to do with this information. I could confront her. I could walk out there immediately and announce exactly what I had overheard. I could create a dramatic scene, expose their entire scheme, and leave this house forever. But that would be too simple, too quick, too easy for them. They would dismiss me as emotional, unstable, vindictive. They would tell themselves I was simply proving everything they already believed about me. No. If I was going to respond to this betrayal, I would do it strategically, on my terms, with a plan they would never anticipate. My aunt had taught me many valuable lessons, but one principle stood above all others. She said that when someone fundamentally underestimates you, they have given you an extraordinary gift, the gift of complete surprise. Diana and Margot had just handed me the greatest gift imaginable. They had no idea whatsoever what I was actually capable of. I fixed my makeup, smoothed my braid, and walked back to the garden room with a pleasant smile on my face. The real game was just beginning now. When I returned to the garden room, something in the atmosphere had shifted. The furniture had been subtly rearranged, the lighting adjusted to something more dramatic. Diana was positioned near the stone fireplace with barely concealed anticipation written across her face. Robert had stationed himself near the entrance, looking profoundly uncomfortable. Margot was pretending to admire a landscape painting, but I caught her glancing at Sophia with a knowing smirk. And Sophia was standing in the center of the room, looking nervous. Too nervous. She turned when I entered, and her face transformed into what was supposed to be an expression of love. She walked toward me, took both my hands in hers, and said she wanted to ask me something important. I felt the trap closing around me with perfect precision. Sophia said she knew we hadn't been together an extraordinarily long time, and that her family could be somewhat intense upon first meeting. But she said she understood what she wanted. She said she wanted me. And then she lowered herself onto one knee. The ring she produced was large and attention-grabbing, exactly the style Diana would select and approve. It was also, I noticed immediately, of questionable actual quality. The stone was slightly cloudy, the setting somewhat uneven. It was the type of ring that appeared impressive in soft lighting, but would reveal its true nature in bright daylight, much like the woman holding it. Sophia asked me to marry her. Behind her, Diana was practically glowing with satisfaction. This was transparently the predetermined plan, the first strategic move in their scheme. Get Sophia publicly committed to me, then engineer a way to eliminate me later. In the meantime, they would use the engagement to keep Vanessa waiting in the wings, dangling the promise of Sophia while they finalized their business arrangements. I understood all of this in the span of a single heartbeat. I also understood that I faced a critical choice. I could reject this proposal from someone who was using me, standing before a family who despised everything about me. I could walk away with my self-respect intact and never see any of them again. But that would conclude the story too prematurely. I thought about what I had overheard in that corridor. I thought about their plans to fabricate some scandal about me. I thought about how they perceived me as unsophisticated, naive, disposable. And I thought about how profoundly satisfying it would be to demonstrate exactly how catastrophically wrong they were about me. So, I said yes. Sophia slipped the ring onto my finger, and Diana began applauding like she was attending a theatrical performance. Margot offered her congratulations with all the genuine warmth of a January blizzard. Robert shook Sophia's hand and told her she had made an excellent decision. Thomas caught my eye from across the room, something perceptive and knowing, like he suspected this story had several more chapters yet to unfold. I smiled directly at him, and he smiled knowingly back. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of champagne toasts and hollow congratulations. Diana discussed engagement party logistics. Margot mentioned potential venues. Robert talked vaguely about business opportunities that might emerge from uniting our families, though he stumbled awkwardly over this, clearly uncertain what my family could possibly contribute. Sophia stayed close beside me, performing the role of devoted fiancée with surprising conviction. If I hadn't heard what her mother and sister had said, I might have believed the performance completely. But I had heard every word, and I would never forget. When the afternoon finally concluded, Sophia walked me to my car. The late afternoon air was cool and crisp, and for a moment, we simply stood there in the circular driveway, looking at each other. She asked if I was doing okay. She said she knew her family could be overwhelming, but she promised they would eventually warm up to me. I said I understood completely. I said I was just tired from everything. She kissed me goodnight, and I drove away from the Hartwell estate, with her ring on my finger and a comprehensive plan forming in my mind. The next morning, I initiated my research phase. If there's one skill my career has definitively taught me, it's the immense power of information. Data, documentation, patterns. I spend my professional days analyzing complex systems, identifying vulnerabilities, developing optimized solutions. I was about to apply those exact same analytical skills to the Hartwell family. And what I discovered over the following days confirmed everything I had overheard and revealed even more. The Hartwell boutiques were indeed experiencing severe financial crisis, not simply a temporary rust patch, but fundamental structural problems. They had expanded too aggressively during economic boom years, accumulated excessive debt, and now those obligations were coming due. Their primary supplier contracts were up for renewal, and several key vendors were exploring other retail partners. The partnership with Vanessa's family wasn't merely strategic, it was absolutely desperate. But that wasn't the only revelation. As I investigated deeper, I uncovered something else. Something the Hartwells almost certainly believed was permanently hidden. Margot had been systematically embezzling from the family business. The amounts had started relatively small, cleverly concealed in expense reports and petty cash accounts. But over several years, they had accumulated substantially, close to $500,000 siphoned away to fund her extravagant lifestyle, while the company struggled toward potential bankruptcy. I printed comprehensive documentation of everything I discovered. Legal filings, financial statements, records of suspicious transactions. And then I began making strategic phone calls. My aunt's name still carried considerable weight in certain business circles. The professional contacts she had cultivated over her decades in business remembered the Chen family with genuine respect. When I reached out to them, they were genuinely pleased to help. One of those valuable contacts happened to know Thomas Wellington quite well, and Thomas, it emerged, had his own complicated history with the Hartwell family. They had cheated him on a significant business transaction nearly 2 decades ago. Nothing technically illegal, just unethical enough to leave lasting resentment. He had been patiently waiting for an appropriate opportunity to balance the scales. I was about to provide him with exactly that opportunity. Before we continue with what happened next, I need to pause and speak directly from my heart. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. Your support genuinely means everything to me, and it helps me continue sharing these stories. Thank you so much. Now let's get back to what unfolded. The following weeks became an elaborate exercise in patience and calculated performance. I played the role of the happy, grateful fiancé with the skill of an award-winning actress. I attended weekly family dinners at the Hartwell estate. I listened to Diana's passive-aggressive commentary with a pleasant smile firmly in place. I watched Margot parade her designer wardrobe and expensive jewelry, knowing precisely where every dollar had originated. And I observed Sophia carefully. She was different now, or perhaps I was simply perceiving her clearly for the first time, seeing past the illusion I had constructed. The attentiveness I had once found endearing now seemed mechanical and rehearsed. The compliments felt scripted rather than spontaneous. And her phone, which she guarded with increasing vigilance, constantly buzzed with messages she quickly concealed from my view. I knew who was sending those messages. I had seen the name flash across her screen more than once. Vanessa. One evening, I told Sophia I was working late on an urgent project deadline. Instead, I parked discreetly near the wine bar where she was supposedly meeting a client for a consultation. She wasn't meeting any client. She was meeting Vanessa. I observed through the front window as they sat together at an intimate corner table, their heads inclined close together, their body language unmistakably romantic. At one point, Sophia reached across the table and held Vanessa's hand. At another moment, Vanessa laughed at something Sophia said and gently touched her cheek. I took photographs, not because I required evidence for any legal proceedings, but because I wanted to preserve this moment with absolute clarity. I wanted to remember exactly who Sophia Hartwell truly was beneath the performance. She wasn't simply weak-willed. She wasn't just someone who couldn't stand up to her domineering family. She was a liar and a cheater, actively maintaining 2 simultaneous relationships, while her family orchestrated the final outcome from behind the scenes. The anger I experienced in that moment was intense and clarifying, but I didn't act on it immediately. Not yet. Instead, I went home and added the photographs to my steadily growing documentation file. Thomas and I had been meeting regularly in secret, always at neutral locations far from anywhere the Hartwells might frequent. He had his own extensive documentation of the family's questionable business practices over the years. He knew other people who had been damaged by their unethical dealings. He was more than willing to assist in bringing them to account, but he asked me a direct question. He said he understood his own motivations clearly, but he wanted to understand mine. Was this purely about revenge, or was there something deeper driving my actions? I considered his question carefully before responding. I told him this wasn't about revenge at all. It was about truth and consequences. I said the Hartwells had spent their entire lives using their wealth and social position to manipulate people. They treated anyone they deemed socially inferior as disposable and insignificant. They were teaching Sophia to perpetuate exactly the same patterns, and they would continue damaging others long after I had exited their lives. I said someone needed to demonstrate that their money and status couldn't shield them from the consequences of their choices and actions. Thomas nodded slowly and thoughtfully. He said my aunt would be genuinely proud of what I was doing. That was the precise moment I knew with absolute certainty I had made the right decision. The engagement party was scheduled for 4 weeks later. The Hartwells were hosting it at their estate, inviting everyone who mattered in their business and social circles. Diana was treating the event like a coronation ceremony, an opportunity to display her perfect family to their entire world. She had no conception whatsoever of what was coming. I spent those 4 weeks in meticulous preparation. I coordinated extensively with Thomas. I made strategic calls to key industry contacts. I even reached out to the primary supplier who was considering terminating their contract with the Hartwell boutiques. They were extremely interested in the information I could provide. And then, the night before the party, I took one final action. I gave Sophia one last opportunity to be honest with me. We were sitting in her apartment, reviewing final details for the party. I asked her casually, almost offhandedly, how she truly felt about us, about our future together. She said she was excited beyond words. She said she couldn't imagine her life without me. I asked if there was anything she wanted to tell me, anything at all. She looked at me with those warm brown eyes I had once found so captivating. She said there was absolutely nothing. She said I was everything she had ever hoped to find. I asked specifically about Vanessa. Her face went completely pale. She recovered quickly, but I had seen that flash of pure panic in her eyes. She said Vanessa was simply an old friend from her past, nothing more than that. I nodded and said I understood everything now. And in that moment, I truly did understand. I understood that Sophia would never tell me the truth voluntarily. She would continue lying directly to my face for as long as it served her purposes and her family's agenda. She was her mother's daughter in every way that mattered. The next evening I dressed in clothes from my actual wardrobe, not the modest gray dress I had worn to that first lunch. This was a designer gown, sophisticated and elegant, worth more than everything Diana would be wearing combined. I studied myself in the full-length mirror and smiled with satisfaction. It was time to show the Hartwell family exactly who they had so catastrophically underestimated. The Hartwell estate had been completely transformed for the engagement celebration. Elegant white pavilions dotted the immaculate gardens. Crystal chandeliers hung from temporary structures, scattering prismatic light across the gathering crowd. A string ensemble played sophisticated classical selections near the ornamental fountain. Servers in pristine uniforms circulated with champagne and elaborate appetizers that probably cost more per piece than some people earned in an hour. Diana had truly exceeded herself. This wasn't simply a party. This was a calculated statement of wealth and status. I arrived in my usual Honda Civic, observing the valet attendants' expressions as they tried to reconcile my modest vehicle with the parade of luxury cars that had preceded mine. One of them actually asked if I was perhaps with the catering staff. I smiled pleasantly and handed him my keys without comment. The walk from the parking area to the main pavilion felt like a transformative journey. With each step, I systematically shed the persona I had been carefully maintaining for weeks. The anxious girlfriend, the grateful fiancée, the simple woman who should feel fortunate for Diana Hartwell's grudging conditional acceptance. Tonight, I was Maya Chen, the authentic version. My gown was deep midnight blue, custom designed by a couturier whose name was spoken with reverence in fashion circles. My jewelry was deliberately understated, but unmistakable to anyone with genuine knowledge of quality pieces. My aunt's sapphire pendant hung at my throat, a piece that had been professionally appraised at more than most luxury vehicles cost. My watch was a limited edition with only 30 examples produced worldwide. I had spent 16 months concealing my true identity. Tonight, that concealment ended permanently. The first person to notice the transformation was someone I didn't recognize. A woman standing near the pavilion entrance, probably someone's wife or partner. She looked at me, did an obvious double-take, and immediately whispered something urgent to her companion. They both stared openly. I continued walking with confidence. The second person to notice was Robert Hartwell. He was greeting arriving guests near the bar area, performing his hosting duties with the mechanical enthusiasm of someone who would vastly prefer to be anywhere else. When he saw me, his practiced welcoming smile froze completely in place. His eyes traveled from my face to my gown to my jewelry and back again, and I watched confusion progressively replace his rehearsed hospitality. I wished him good evening and thanked him for hosting such a beautiful celebration. He stammered something vague about being pleased I could attend, his eyes still desperately trying to solve the puzzle I presented. I moved on before he could formulate any direct questions. The main pavilion contained perhaps 200 guests. A meticulously curated collection of business associates, society figures, and family connections. I recognized numerous faces from my research. The regional supplier representatives, several competing boutique owners, a journalist from the prominent business magazine, and there, holding court near the champagne display, was Diana Hartwell herself. She was wearing an ivory gown that had undoubtedly cost a substantial sum, though it was clearly purchased retail, despite her obvious efforts to suggest it was custom. Her jewelry was impressive by ordinary standards, but unremarkable by the standards of authentic, generational wealth. She was laughing at something one of her guests had said, her head thrown back in that practiced manner that suggested she had learned to perform amusement rather than genuinely experience it. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and made my way deliberately through the crowd, pausing to introduce myself to several guests along the way. Each interaction followed an identical pattern. Initial confusion at my appearance. Surprise when I mentioned I was Sophia's fiancé. Renewed confusion when my gown, my jewelry, my entire manner contradicted whatever they had been told to expect about me. Word was spreading rapidly. I could observe it in the whispers, the sidelong glances, the phones being discreetly checked as people attempted to research who I actually was. Perfect. Exactly as planned. I finally reached Diana's circle just as she was concluding an elaborate story about her recent charitable foundation work. She turned to greet the newcomer with her standard artificial smile firmly in place, and then her face underwent a truly remarkable transformation. First incomprehension, then recognition, then disbelief, then something that resembled genuine fear. She said my name like it was a question she didn't want answered. I said good evening, and thanked her sincerely for organizing such an exquisite party. Her eyes were moving rapidly, frantically cataloging every detail of my appearance. The gown that cost more than her monthly household expenses, the pendant that had been featured in a prestigious jewelry publication, the watch she had probably only seen in luxury advertisements. She asked in a carefully controlled voice that couldn't quite hide the tremor beneath where I had acquired these things. I said they were simply pieces I had been saving for an appropriately special occasion. Margot materialized at her mother's side, summoned by some invisible family distress signal. She looked at me, and her expression traced the same journey Diana's face had. Confusion, recognition, utter disbelief. But Margot recovered more quickly than her mother. She said with artificial sweetness that the gown was interesting. She asked if perhaps it was a rental. I told her the designer's name directly. I said he was a personal acquaintance who had created it specifically for me. The designer's name hit Margot like a physical impact. This was someone who dressed international celebrities, who maintained a waiting list measured in years, who absolutely did not create gowns for struggling lab technicians who could barely afford monthly rent. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words emerged. I politely excused myself to find Sophia. As I walked away, I heard Diana hiss something urgent to Margot about discovering what was happening. I heard Margot's confused, almost panicked response that she had no idea, that none of this made any logical sense. I smiled to myself and continued walking. The first phase of the evening was complete. The seed of doubt had been planted successfully. Now it was time to cultivate it. Sophia found me before I located her. She emerged from a cluster of guests near the bar, her face drained of color, and her eyes wide with confusion and something approaching alarm. She had clearly heard the rapidly spreading whispers, observed the reactions, attempted to reconcile the woman standing before her with the woman she believed she knew. She asked urgently what was happening. She asked where I had gotten the gown, the jewelry, this complete transformation. She asked why I looked like an entirely different person. I said calmly that I looked like myself. My authentic self. She stared at me, and I watched something shift behind her eyes. Not full comprehension exactly, more like the first visible crack in a carefully constructed wall that had been concealing an uncomfortable truth. She asked if we could talk privately somewhere. I said later would be better. I said this was our engagement party after all. We had guests we needed to attend to properly. Before she could protest further, I took her arm firmly and guided her toward a group of business associates. These were the people who controlled the luxury home goods industry in our region. The individuals whose opinions and decisions genuinely mattered to the Hartwell boutique's survival. They had been observing my entrance with undisguised fascination. I introduced myself properly this time. I stated my full name and mentioned my position and company. I watched their expressions shift dramatically as they recognized the company name, as they realized precisely who I actually was. One of them, a distinguished silver-haired woman who managed a competing boutique chain, said she had definitely heard of me. She said her daughter worked in pharmaceutical research and had mentioned my name in connection with some groundbreaking predictive health algorithms. Another guest, a man who handled investment strategies for a major venture capital firm, asked if I was related to Margaret Chen. I confirmed she was my aunt. The man's eyebrows rose significantly. He said my aunt had been an absolutely remarkable businesswoman. He said the Chen name still carried substantial weight in certain financial and medical supply circles. I could feel Sophia growing increasingly tense beside me. She had no comprehension of what any of this actually meant. She had never asked substantive questions about my family beyond the most superficial level. She had assumed limited financial means equaled insignificance, and she had never bothered to investigate deeper. Her catastrophic mistake. The evening continued, and with each conversation the truth spread further and wider. People were talking, checking their devices, confirming details and backgrounds. The narrative was shifting fundamentally beneath the Hartwell's feet. Thomas arrived approximately an hour into the party. He found me near the rose garden, momentarily alone, while Sophia was pulled away by her father for some urgent family conversation. Thomas said the primary supplier's representative had arrived. He said the man had been extremely interested in the comprehensive documentation Thomas had shared with him earlier in the week. I asked if he felt prepared for what came next. Thomas said he had been prepared and waiting for nearly 20 years. We spoke for several more minutes, confirming final details of what would happen next. Then, Thomas melted seamlessly back into the crowd, and I returned to my role as the happy, devoted fiancé. Diana located me next. She had recovered some measure of her composure, though I could detect the strain in the tightness around her eyes and mouth. She pulled me aside with a grip that was considerably stronger than necessary, and demanded to know what exactly I thought I was doing. I asked innocently what she meant. She said I knew precisely what she meant. She said the gown, the jewelry, the stories I was telling people about my aunt, and my professional position. She said she wanted to know immediately what my game was. I said there was no game whatsoever. I said I was simply being my authentic self. She said that was completely impossible. She said Sophia had told her explicitly about my circumstances. She said I was a lab technician who lived in a tiny studio apartment and drove a vehicle that belonged in a scrapyard. I said Sophia had made certain assumptions based on limited information. I said I had never actually stated those things as facts. Diana's face went completely still. I explained calmly that I had said I worked in medical research, which was absolutely true. I had said I had a support role, which was also accurate, since architects provide essential support to development teams. I had said I lived simply, which I genuinely do. I said I had never claimed to be financially struggling. I had simply never corrected their assumptions about my circumstances. She asked why with barely controlled fury. I looked at her directly, holding her gaze. I said my aunt taught me that someone's authentic character only reveals itself when they believe nobody significant is observing them. I said I wanted to understand who the Hartwell family truly was beneath their polished social performance. Diana's face drained of all color. I said now I knew exactly who they were. Before she could formulate any response, the string ensemble stopped playing. Robert Hartwell's voice came over the speaker system, announcing it was time for the official toasts and formal speeches. Diana looked at me with something that definitely resembled fear now. I smiled pleasantly and walked toward the small stage. The main event was about to begin. The stage had been constructed at the far end of the main pavilion, decorated with elaborate flowers and soft romantic lighting. that was probably intended to be touching, but instead felt like a spotlight waiting for its defining moment. Robert stood at the microphone, welcoming guests and thanking them for coming to celebrate this special occasion. He spoke about family values, about tradition, about the critical importance of strong partnerships in both business and personal life. His eyes kept darting nervously to Diana, who was making her way through the crowd toward the stage, with the determination of a general approaching a crucial battlefield. She reached the microphone just as Robert was finishing his prepared remarks. She took over seamlessly, her composure apparently back in place, her smile as frozen and artificial as ever. She said she was absolutely delighted to welcome everyone to this celebration of her daughter's engagement. She said Sophia had found herself a wonderful person, someone who would be a perfect addition to the Hartwell family legacy. She said they had exciting plans for the future, plans that would ensure the Hartwell business legacy continued thriving for generations. Then she began hinting at significant business developments. She talked about growth and expansion opportunities. She talked about new strategic partnerships and beneficial alliances. She talked about the Hartwell boutiques entering an exciting new chapter of success and prosperity. I watched the primary supplier's representative shift uncomfortably in his position. I saw Thomas catch his eye and give an almost imperceptible nod. Diana was building towards something specific. She was using this engagement party as a platform for some kind of business announcement, almost certainly related to the Castellano merger that was supposed to rescue their failing company. She called Sophia to the stage. Sophia climbed the steps looking profoundly nervous, though she was attempting to conceal it behind her practiced smile. She stood beside her mother and looked out at the crowd, searching for me, her expression complicated and uncertain. Diana said there was one more person who needed to be on this stage. She said she wanted to properly welcome her future daughter-in-law, the woman who had captured her daughter's heart so completely. She said my name, and the entire crowd turned to look at me. I set down my champagne glass carefully and walked toward the stage with measured confidence. The pavilion fell completely silent, except for my footsteps. Every eye tracked my movement. Everyone present understood that something significant was happening, that this engagement party was about to transform into something entirely different. I climbed the steps and stood beside Sophia. She reached for my hand, but her grip was uncertain and questioning. Diana handed me the microphone with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. She said she was confident I wanted to say a few words to everyone. I looked at the microphone in my hand. I looked at Sophia. I looked at Diana, who still believed she maintained control of this situation. I looked at the crowd filled with people who could make or break the Hartwell family's future with their decisions and opinions. I said yes, I absolutely did want to say a few words. And then I began to speak with clarity and purpose. I said I wanted to thank Diana for the warm welcome she had extended to me. I said I wanted to acknowledge the Hartwell family for showing me exactly who they were over these past weeks. Diana's smile flickered noticeably. I said when I first came to this house, I made a deliberate decision. I decided to present a simple, unassuming version of myself to the Hartwells. A woman without expensive clothes or impressive professional credentials. A woman they might consider beneath their social notice. The crowd was utterly, completely silent. I said I wanted to observe how they would treat someone they believed couldn't benefit them in any way. Someone they believed had nothing valuable to offer their family. Someone they believed was, in Diana's own words, ordinary. Diana's face went absolutely white. I described the lunch where I had been compared unfavorably to Sophia's ex-girlfriend. I described the whispered insults Diana thought I couldn't hear. I described being compared to confused household staff, being called ordinary, being treated with contempt by people who knew absolutely nothing about me. Sophia was staring at me now, her face a mask of dawning horror. I said, and then I heard something I wasn't supposed to hear. I described the conversation in the study. I described Margot and Diana discussing strategies to remove me from Sophia's life. I described learning that I was simply a placeholder, someone to keep Sophia occupied while the family arranged her actual future with Vanessa Castellano. Audible gasps rippled through the crowd. I said I discovered the Hartwell boutiques were experiencing severe financial crisis. I said I learned they were desperate for a merger with the Castellano family to avoid bankruptcy. I said I found out Sophia had been maintaining her romantic relationship with Vanessa the entire time we were together. I pulled out my phone and displayed a photograph on the large screen behind me. Sophia and Vanessa at the wine bar, holding hands across the table, their intimacy undeniable. I said this photograph was taken 3 weeks ago, while Sophia was supposedly working late on a client project. The crowd erupted in shocked whispers and exclamations. Sophia grabbed my arm desperately. She said this wasn't what it appeared to be. She said she could explain everything. I said she had already explained more than enough. I said I had given her the opportunity to be honest with me the previous night, and she had deliberately chosen to lie. I turned back to face the crowd. I said there was more they needed to know. The pavilion had fallen completely silent again. Every person in attendance understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. The comfortable rules of polite society events had been completely suspended. The carefully maintained masks were coming off. I said I had spent the past several weeks thoroughly researching the Hartwell family business. I said I had discovered some extremely interesting information. I mentioned the financial records documenting their overextended credit. I mentioned the supplier contracts that were about to be terminated. Robert Hartwell's face had turned an unhealthy gray color. I said I had also uncovered evidence of something considerably more serious. I looked directly at Margot, who was standing near the back of the pavilion, frozen in place like someone caught in headlights. I said Margot Hartwell had been systematically embezzling from the family company for years. I said the amounts had begun small, but had grown substantially over time. I said the total was now approaching $500,000. Margot's husband turned to look at her, with an expression of pure shock and betrayal. Margot shouted that it was a lie. She said I had no proof of anything. She said I was simply a bitter, vindictive woman trying to destroy their family. Thomas stepped forward from the crowd. He said he absolutely had proof. He walked toward the stage, carrying a substantial folder that I knew contained years of documentation. Bank records, expense reports, transaction histories, everything necessary to prove exactly what Margot had done. He handed the folder directly to the supplier's representative, who had moved closer to the stage, with the expression of someone whose worst suspicions were being comprehensively confirmed. Thomas said he had been waiting a very long time for this moment. He said the Hartwells had cheated him on a significant business deal 2 decades ago, and he had never forgotten. He said when I had approached him with evidence of their current unethical practices, he had been more than happy to contribute what he knew. Diana found her voice finally. She said this was absolutely outrageous. She said we had no right whatsoever to make these accusations publicly. She said she would sue both of us for defamation. I said she was entirely welcome to try legal action. I said everything I had shared was thoroughly documented and completely verifiable. I said the financial records were public information accessible to anyone who understood where to look. I said the evidence of Margot's embezzlement had been compiled from sources that would withstand scrutiny in any court of law. I looked at Sophia, who was still standing beside me, looking like someone whose entire world had just collapsed around her. I said there was one more thing I needed to do. I reached up and carefully removed the engagement ring from my finger. The cloudy stone caught the light, revealing all its flaws and imperfections. I said I would not be marrying Sophia Hartwell. I said I had never genuinely intended to. Not after I learned the complete truth about her and her family. I said the only reason I had accepted her proposal was to give them sufficient rope to hang themselves with their own actions. I handed the ring back to Sophia. I suggested she should give it to Vanessa instead. I said Vanessa was clearly the person she actually wanted. Sophia's face crumpled completely. She said that wasn't true at all. She said she had real feelings for me. She said the situation with Vanessa was purely business, something her mother had orchestrated and pressured her into. I said that was precisely the fundamental problem. I said she had allowed her mother to orchestrate her entire life, her relationships, her future. I said she had never once genuinely defended me when her family attacked me. I said she had lied directly to my face about Vanessa, even when I explicitly gave her the opportunity to be honest. I said someone who couldn't be truthful with the person they claimed to love was not someone I wanted to build a life with. The crowd was absolutely silent. I turned to face them one final time. I said I was Maya Chen. I said I was a lead data scientist who had built a successful career through dedicated work and unwavering integrity. I said I earned more in a single month than many people earned in an entire year. And I chose to live simply because my aunt had taught me that financial wealth was never the true measure of someone's value or character. I said the Hartwells had revealed their authentic character to me. They had exposed themselves as people who judged others strictly by their bank accounts and social status. They had treated me with contempt because they believed I had nothing valuable to offer their family. I said that kind of character would eventually destroy them, regardless of whether I helped accelerate that process. I set the microphone down on the podium and walked off the stage. The crowd parted from me like water dividing. No one spoke. No one attempted to stop me or question me. Behind me, I heard the chaos beginning to erupt. I didn't look back as I walked through the pavilion, but I could hear absolutely everything unfolding. Patricia's voice, rising in pitch and desperation, trying desperately to salvage the situation. She was insisting there had been a terrible misunderstanding, that I was clearly emotionally disturbed, that nothing I had said was actually true. But the damage was irreversibly done. I could hear the supplier's representative speaking urgently into his phone, his voice clipped and coldly professional. I could hear other guests murmuring, some already heading rapidly for the exits, wanting to distance themselves from the disaster unfolding before them. I reached the edge of the pavilion and paused briefly. Margot had cornered her husband near the bar area, desperately trying to explain, trying to justify her actions. His expression was stone. He was looking at her like he had never truly seen her before, like the woman he had married had been replaced by a complete stranger. Robert was slumped heavily in a chair, his head in his hands. The patriarch of the Hartwell business empire, brought devastatingly low by the exposure of secrets he had probably suspected but never wanted to acknowledge. And Sophia was standing alone on the stage, the rejected ring still clutched in her trembling hand. She was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Anger, profound grief, regret. It didn't matter anymore. None of it mattered. I walked out of the pavilion and into the cool evening air. The stars were brilliant overhead, completely indifferent to the human drama playing out beneath them. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with air that felt cleaner somehow, lighter and more pure. Thomas found me by the ornamental fountain several minutes later. He said it was finished. He said the supplier had already made the decisive call. The Hartwell boutiques would lose their primary supplier contracts by the end of the current month. I asked if he felt satisfied with the outcome. He said satisfaction wasn't precisely the right word for what he felt. He said it felt more like relief, like a long-standing debt that had finally been properly paid. I understood exactly what he meant. He asked what I planned to do now. I said I would go home. I said I would sleep peacefully for the first time in weeks. I said I would wake up tomorrow morning and continue building the life I had created for myself, the life that had absolutely nothing to do with Sophia Hartwell or her family. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. He said my aunt would have been genuinely proud of me tonight. I felt unexpected tears prick at my eyes. I said I truly hoped so. He handed me a business card. He said if I ever needed anything at all, I should call him without hesitation. He said he owed me considerably more than he could ever repay. I tucked the card carefully into my small evening bag and thanked him sincerely. Then I walked to the valet station, collected my old Honda Civic from a thoroughly confused attendant, and drove away from the Hartwell estate for the absolute last time. In my rearview mirror, I could see guests streaming out of the pavilion in disorder, the party dissolving into complete chaos. I could see Diana gesturing wildly, still desperately trying to control a narrative that had slipped entirely beyond her grasp. I turned my eyes back to the road ahead and didn't look back again. The drive home was quiet and contemplative. I didn't turn on music. I didn't call anyone. I simply drove through the night, letting the miles create distance between me and everything that had happened. When I finally reached my modest apartment, I sat in the car for a long moment before going inside. I thought about Sophia, about the person I had believed she was, and the person she had actually turned out to be. I thought about how dangerously close I had come to marrying her, to binding my life permanently to hers, to becoming part of a family that would have treated me with contempt forever. I thought about my aunt and the crucial lesson she had taught me about character and true worth. And I thought about my future, the one I would build for myself on my own terms, with people who valued me for who I genuinely was, rather than what I could provide them. I got out of the car and went inside. My apartment was small and simple, exactly the way I preferred it. I made myself a cup of herbal tea, changed out of my designer gown into comfortable clothes, and sat by the window in my favorite worn robe. The city lights sparkled below me, thousands of lives unfolding in thousands of windows. I was just one of them, nothing particularly special or extraordinary, and that was exactly, perfectly how I wanted it. If you feel my words resonating with you, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. Your support means absolutely everything. 1 week later, I was sitting at my small kitchen table with my morning coffee, when my phone alerted me to a news notification. The headline read, "Hartwell Luxury Boutiques Facing Closure After Major Supplier Termination." I read the article slowly and carefully, absorbing every detail. The primary suppliers had officially ended their partnership with the Hartwell boutiques, citing serious concerns about financial management and ethical business practices. Without those crucial supplier agreements, the boutiques couldn't stock their signature luxury home goods. Without quality inventory, the business simply couldn't survive. The article mentioned that several former business partners had come forward with their own complaints about the Hartwell family's practices over the years. It mentioned that an internal investigation had revealed significant financial irregularities that were now being reviewed by appropriate authorities. It mentioned that Margot Hartwell had been asked to resign from her position in the company, pending further legal inquiry. It did not mention my name anywhere. I had specifically asked Thomas to keep my identity out of the public story, and he had honored that request completely. The story would be about the Hartwells' own unethical actions and misdeeds, not about the woman who had exposed them. I didn't want fame or public recognition. I simply wanted the truth to emerge into daylight where it belonged. And it had. I finished my coffee slowly and looked around my small, simple kitchen, the same kitchen I had been sitting in weeks ago when I had first driven to the Hartwell estate to meet Sophia's family. The same kitchen where I had made the decision to test them, to see who they genuinely were beneath their polished, perfect surface. So much had fundamentally changed since that day, and so much had remained exactly perfectly the same. My phone buzzed again with an incoming text message. This time it was from Sophia. She said she desperately needed to see me. She said she could explain everything that had happened. She said she had made terrible mistakes, but she still cared deeply about me. She asked if we could meet somewhere for coffee, just to talk things through. I looked at the message for a long, thoughtful moment. Then I deleted it without responding. Some doors, once properly closed, should remain closed forever. I stood up from the table and walked to my window, looking out at the morning sun rising brilliantly over the city. It was going to be a beautiful day. A day for new beginnings, for moving confidently forward, for building something authentically better. My aunt's sapphire pendant hung at my throat, warm against my skin. I touched it gently, thinking about the remarkable woman who had taught me everything crucial I knew about character and genuine worth. She had lived her life simply and deliberately, not because she had to, but because she understood profoundly that the things that truly matter cannot be purchased. Love, integrity, self-respect, the knowledge that you have acted according to your deepest principles, even when compromise would have been easier. The Hartwells had believed they could buy their way through life. They had believed their money and social status made them superior to everyone else, entitled to treat people however they wanted without facing consequences. They had been catastrophically wrong. I turned away from the window and got ready for work. My regular position at my regular company, doing the work I genuinely loved, with people who respected me for my skills and character, rather than my financial portfolio. The story of the Hartwell family would continue unfolding in the coming weeks and months. There would be investigations and legal proceedings. There would be consequences and serious repercussions. The empire they had built on a foundation of arrogance and calculated deception would crumble steadily, piece by piece. But that was their story now, not mine anymore. My story was just beginning, and it would be written entirely on my own terms, in my own words, according to my own deeply held values. That was the lesson my aunt had taught me through her example. That was the truth I had carried with me through every moment of the past challenging weeks. A person's worth isn't measured by their bank account or their social status or the opinions of people like Diana Hartwell. It's measured by their character, by the choices they make when nobody important is watching, by the way they treat people who seemingly can't do anything for them in return. The Hartwells had failed that test completely and utterly, and I had finally found the answer I had been searching for all along. The answer was that I didn't need their approval or acceptance. I didn't need Sophia's love if it came with conditions and deception. I didn't need anyone's external validation to know my own worth. I already knew exactly who I was, and that knowledge was enough. That was more than enough.